The rain poured heavily as Daniel stood under the dim glow of the street lamp, his eyes fixed on the cafe across the street. Through the glass window, he saw her, Mia, laughing as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her laughter wasn't for him anymore, it was for someone else. The man sitting across from her leaned in slightly, hanging on to her every word. He was charming, confident, and worst of all, he was everything Daniel had refused to be. For years, Mia had been by Daniel's side, always waiting, always hoping. She had cared for him in ways he never acknowledged, remembering his coffee just the way he liked it, checking on him when he worked late, standing by him when he pushed the world away. But he had never truly seen her. He had convinced himself that love wasn't something he needed. He was too focused on his career, too closed off to the idea of something real. Every time she'd reached out, he had kept his distance, ignoring the way her eyes silently pleaded for him to see her. She had once surprised him on his birthday, waiting outside his office with a small cake and a shy smile. He had barely glanced at it, brushing past her with a distracted, "You shouldn't have." That was always his way. Cold, distant, as if her affection was something he had no use for. Mia had pretended not to be hurt, but Daniel had noticed the way her smile faded, the way her hands tightened around the small box she had held out for him. He had told himself it didn't matter. She would always be there. She always had been. But now, as he stood watching her from a distance, something twisted inside him. It was jealousy, yes, but also something deeper, an unfamiliar sense of loss, a sinking realization that she had finally stopped waiting for him. The man sitting with her slid a small bouquet of flowers across the table, and Mia's eyes lit up in a way Daniel had never seen before. The way she smiled, the way she looked at this stranger, sent a sharp pang through his chest. His hands clenched into fists. He had never cared about flowers, never thought such a simple gesture meant anything. But now, watching someone else give them to Mia, he realized the weight of every moment he had ignored. He had spent years rejecting her without ever saying the words. Now, someone else had stepped in, showing her the love he had always denied her. The cafe door swung open and Mia stepped out, her laughter still lingering in the air. Daniel instinctively took a step forward, but she didn't even glance in his direction. She walked past him as if he were a stranger. The realization hit him like a blow. She wasn't just moving on, she already had. Daniel stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in a way that felt foreign to him. He had never thought much about losing Mia before, because he had never believed it could happen. She had always been there, just a step behind him, waiting. But now, as she walked past him without a single glance, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Fear. He turned on his heels, watching her figure disappear into the rainy night. The man beside her, tall, confident, effortlessly charming, reached out to pull her hood over her head, shielding her from the downpour. She tilted her head up at him, smiling, whispering something that made him chuckle. The sound grated on Daniel's nerves. It was a laugh that had once belonged to him, or at least he had thought it did. His feet moved before his mind could stop them. He followed at a distance, his chest tight, his breath shallow. He told himself he wasn't stalking her, that he wasn't desperate. He just needed to understand, needed to know how this had happened, how she had gone from waiting for him to walking away so easily. But deep down, he already knew. Mia had once been the kind of woman who would drop everything for him. He remembered the late nights at the office when she would wait for him to finish, offering to drive him home when he was too exhausted to move. He had never accepted, not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he had never wanted to give her the wrong idea. She had always been just a friend, someone safe, someone who cared too much, and he had assumed she would never leave. But the way she looked at this new man, the softness in her eyes, the ease in her smile, Daniel knew she had left him a long time ago. He had just been too blind to see it. They stopped in front of a sleek black car, and the man reached for the door, opening it for her. Mia hesitated for a moment, glancing up at the sky as if lost in thought. And then, for the first time that night, she turned her head, her eyes locking onto Daniel's. His breath caught. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time in years. And in that moment, Daniel expected something, maybe a flicker of the old Mia, the girl who had once adored him, the girl who had spent so long hoping he would turn around. But there was nothing. No sadness, no longing, no regret. Just quiet recognition, as if she were looking at a stranger on the street. Daniel's stomach twisted. He wanted to say something, to call out to her, to tell her to wait. But before he could even part his lips, she turned away, stepping into the car without another glance. The man beside her followed, shutting the door behind them. The engine hummed to life, and just like that, they were gone. Daniel stood in the rain long after their car disappeared down the road, his clothes soaked, his hands trembling. For the first time in his life, he realized what it felt like to be the one left behind. Daniel barely felt the rain seeping into his clothes, the cold biting at his skin. His eyes were fixed on the empty street where Mia's car had disappeared. His hands clenched at his sides, frustration bubbling inside him like a storm waiting to break. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to move on. Not like this. Not so easily. His mind raced through the memories, through every moment he had dismissed her, through every time she had looked at him with silent hope in her eyes. How had he been so blind? Or had he just been arrogant enough to believe she would always be there, waiting for him to wake up? A part of him wanted to shake it off. Maybe this was just a phase. Maybe she was only trying to make him jealous. But, deep down, Daniel knew the truth. Mia was gone in a way that no amount of regret could undo. And the man beside her, the one who had given her flowers in broad daylight, who had opened the car door like she was the most important person in the world, he was the reason why. Daniel's jaw tightened. Who was this guy? Where had he come from? And more importantly, how had he done in weeks what Daniel had failed to do for years? Make Mia happy? The thought sent a sharp pain through his chest, one he didn't want to name. It was too raw, too unfamiliar, too dangerous. He had never been jealous before. He had never needed to be. But now it felt like jealousy was burning through his veins, setting fire to something he had never thought possible. He needed answers. Daniel turned sharply, heading back toward his car. The rain blurred his vision, but his mind was sharper than it had ever been. He didn't care if he had been too late before. He wasn't about to lose Mia without a fight. As soon as he slid into the driver's seat, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over her contact, hesitation creeping in for the first time. What was he supposed to say? That he was sorry? That he suddenly realized she mattered? That he had spent years pushing her away only to decide now, when she was happy without him, that he wanted her back? It sounded pathetic, even to him. He let out a slow breath, gripping the steering wheel as if it could hold him together. Then, instead of calling, he did something he had never done before. He scrolled. Her social media was never something he had paid much attention to before. Mia had always been there in real life. Why would he need to check on her online? But now, as he stared at her recent posts, it felt like he was looking into a life he had never been a part of. There were pictures of her at work, laughing with colleagues, photos of her in a coffee shop, her eyes sparkling as she held a mug close to her face. And then, the one that made his stomach twist, a picture of her and him, the stranger, the man who had taken his place without even trying. They stood side by side in what looked like a restaurant, a dimly lit table behind them. Mia's smile was effortless, her body leaning toward him in a way that made Daniel's fingers curl into a fist. The man had his arm loosely around her waist, as if he belonged there, as if he had every right to hold her like that. Daniel stared at the image for what felt like forever, his breath shallow. Then, without thinking, he clicked on the comments. His stomach dropped. "You two look amazing together. So happy for you, Mia. He's such a gentleman. You deserve the best, girl. Finally, someone who knows how to treat you right." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Finally, as if she had been waiting for something better to come along, as if he, Daniel, had never been the right choice in the first place. The realization hit harder than he expected. He had spent so long convincing himself that he was in control, that if he ever wanted Mia, she would still be there, waiting. But she wasn't. She had moved on. She had found someone who saw her worth immediately, who didn't waste years keeping her at arm's length. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt something unfamiliar, clawing at his chest. Panic. Mia was slipping away. No, she was already gone, unless he did something about it. Without another second of hesitation, Daniel threw his car into gear and sped off into the night. He didn't know where he was going yet, but one thing was clear. He wasn't about to let Mia walk away without a fight. Daniel gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His pulse pounded in his ears as he sped through the empty streets, his mind consumed by a storm of thoughts he couldn't control. He had never been the kind of man to chase after anyone. He had always been the one who was pursued, the one who had the upper hand. But now, for the first time, he felt powerless. Mia was gone. And worse, she was happy without him. The memory of her laughter, the way she had looked at that man with something Daniel had never seen in her eyes before, peace, sent a wave of frustration through him. He had been so sure she would always be there, waiting. Now, it was as if she had wiped away every trace of the woman who had once adored him. But Daniel wasn't ready to accept that. He needed to talk to her. He needed to see her, to remind her of everything they had been, everything they could still be. He didn't know what he would say yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just sit back and watch someone else take the place that should have been his. His fingers hovered over her contact again, but something held him back. Would she even answer? Or would she ignore him the way he had ignored her for years? The thought sent another sharp pang through his chest. He hadn't even realized how much he had taken her for granted. She had been a constant presence in his life, always there when he needed her, always putting him first. And he had given her nothing in return, just cold words, distant glances, and a heart locked away behind walls too high for her to climb. Now, someone else had torn those walls down without even trying. His jaw clenched as he finally made a decision. He wasn't going to call. He needed to see her in person, to make her look him in the eye and tell him that she was truly done. That was the only way he would believe it. With a quick turn, he changed direction, heading toward her apartment. The streets were slick with rain, the city lights reflecting off the pavement in distorted patterns. His heart hammered in his chest as he pulled up to her building. The moment he stepped out of the car, he realized how reckless this was. He had no plan, no words prepared. He just knew he needed to see her. As he approached the entrance, his footsteps slowed. He had been here countless times before, but never like this. Never with desperation clawing at his insides. He raised his hand to knock but hesitated, His fingers hovered inches from the door, doubt creeping in. What if she refused to open it? What if she slammed the door in his face? The thought was unbearable. Taking a deep breath, he finally knocked. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. He counted them in his head, each one heavier than the last. Then, the door creaked open. Mia stood before him, wrapped in a loose sweater, her hair slightly damp as if she had just showered. Her eyes widened in surprise, but there was no warmth in them, no flicker of the affection that had once been so easy to find. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Daniel cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of himself. "Hey." Her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but she didn't. She simply studied him, waiting. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" Her voice was calm, controlled, not angry, not bitter, just indifferent. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. Daniel swallowed hard. He had expected resistance, maybe even a cold stare, but not this. Not a version of Mia who no longer seemed to care. He hesitated, realizing for the first time how empty his excuse sounded, now that he was standing in front of her. "I needed to see you." Her brows lifted slightly, but she didn't move. Why? A simple question, but it was the one he had no answer for. Why? Why was he here? To win her back? To prove something? To feed his own ego? Mia let out a quiet sigh, her fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of her sweater. "Daniel." There was something tired in her voice, something final. "You don't get to do this." His chest tightened. "Do what?" "Show up now," she said softly. "After all this time." The words hit harder than he expected. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even accusing him of anything. She was simply stating a fact, a truth he hadn't been ready to face. He had ignored her for years. And now that she was slipping away, he had suddenly decided she mattered. He ran a hand through his wet hair, trying to find the right words. But Mia had already made up her mind. "You should go," she said, her voice still calm, still unwavering. "There's nothing left to say." For a moment, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. He had thought that if he just saw her, if he just spoke to her, she would understand. That she would see what he was only realizing now. But she didn't. She wasn't waiting for him to wake up anymore. She had already moved on. And for the first time in his life, Daniel had no idea what to do next. Daniel stood there frozen, the weight of Mia's words settling heavily in his chest. The rain had stopped, but the damp air clung to his skin, making him feel suffocated. He had come here expecting something. Maybe anger, maybe an argument, maybe even a sliver of the old Mia who would have at least listened. But instead, she had given him nothing. No emotion, no hesitation. Just a simple truth. You should go. His throat felt tight as he stared at her, searching her face for any sign that she didn't mean it, that there was still a piece of her that cared. But there wasn't. She stood firm, her arms crossed loosely, her expression unreadable. The Mia he had known, the one who used to light up at the sight of him, who always found a reason to stay even when he pushed her away, was gone. And in her place stood a woman who had finally learned to walk away. A bitter taste filled his mouth as reality hit him like a brick. Is this really it? His voice was quieter than he intended, almost as if he were asking himself rather than her. Mia exhaled slowly, shifting her weight slightly, but she didn't move to close the door just yet. She studied him, her gaze steady but unreadable. "Daniel, what do you want me to say?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What did he want her to say? That she had been waiting for him all this time? That she'd only moved on to make him jealous? That she would drop everything and come running back if he just said the right words? He wanted her to say something, anything, that would make this ache in his chest go away. But she didn't. Instead, she shook her head, her expression softening, but only slightly. You can't just show up now and expect things to be the same. Daniel's jaw clenched. I know, he admitted. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face, frustrated at his own inability to explain himself. I just don't get it. How can you act like I don't matter to you anymore? For the first time, something flickered in Mia's eyes. Not anger, not sadness. Something else, something closer to disbelief. She let out a short, humourless laugh, shaking her head as she looked at him. You really don't get it, do you? Daniel swallowed, his frustration mounting. Then explain it to me. Mia's gaze locked onto his, and this time she didn't hold back. You mattered to me, Daniel. For years, you mattered to me. And do you know what I got for it? Nothing. The bluntness of her words made his stomach drop. I waited, she continued, her voice steady but firm. I waited for you to see me. I waited for you to care. I waited for you to give me something, even the smallest sign that I wasn't wasting my time. She shook her head, a sad smile tugging at the corner of her lips. But you never did. Daniel felt his fingers twitch, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It wasn't that I stopped caring about you, she went on. It was that I finally realised you were never going to care the way I needed you to. And I got tired of waiting. Silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Daniel wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he had always cared, that he had just been too stupid to show it. But something about the way she looked at him, the calmness, the finality, made the words die in his throat. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He had taken her for granted. He had ignored every sign, every moment, every opportunity to hold on to her when she was still reaching for him. He had pushed her away over and over again, convinced she would always come back. But she wasn't coming back. A sharp ache settled in his chest, something raw and unfamiliar. It wasn't just jealousy anymore. It was regret, deep, gnawing regret that he couldn't shake, no matter how much he wanted to. He took a step forward, his voice low. Mia. She shook her head. No, Daniel. Don't do this. His breath hitched. Do what? Act like you suddenly care now that I'm not waiting for you anymore. Her words sliced through him. I'm not trying to... He stopped himself because wasn't that exactly what he was doing? She sighed, looking at him the way someone looks at an old wound that no longer hurts. You had years, Daniel, years. And now, when I'm finally happy without you, now you decide you want me. Daniel felt his stomach twist. Mia didn't say it out of anger. There was no resentment in her voice, no bitterness. And somehow that made it worse. Because anger meant there was still something left. But this was closure, and he wasn't ready for that. His mind raced, searching for something to say, something to fix the damage he had caused. But for the first time in his life, words weren't enough. Mia glanced past him as if contemplating something, before stepping back slightly. I should go. Panic flared in Daniel's chest. Mia, wait! But she was already closing the door. He caught one last glimpse of her face. Calm, steady, done, before the door shut completely, leaving him standing there, alone in the cold. Daniel took a slow step back, his hands trembling at his sides. He had come here to stop her from slipping away, but instead, He had watched her let him go, and this time there was nothing he could do about it. Daniel stood motionless in front of Mia's door, his mind blank, his chest hollow. He had never known what it felt like to lose something until now. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the finality of it. The way she had spoken, the way she had looked at him, as if he was nothing more than a memory from her past. The worst part? He had done this to himself. He let out a sharp breath, stepping back as he ran a hand through his damp hair. His body felt heavy, like it no longer belonged to him. His entire world had shifted in the span of a few minutes, and now he was standing in the aftermath of something he never thought would happen. Mia was gone, and she wasn't coming back. His fingers twitched at his sides as he debated knocking again, as if somehow, if he just got her to listen, things would change. But deep down, he knew better. She had already listened. She had listened for years. He was the one who had never spoken, never given her anything to hold on to. And now, she had stopped listening. His stomach churned with frustration, his jaw tightening as he turned away from the door. His mind screamed at him to do something. Fight for her, tell her you love her, tell her you were wrong. But his feet kept moving in the opposite direction. He barely registered himself stepping back onto the wet pavement, barely noticed the distant sound of traffic or the low rumble of thunder in the sky. The city around him felt foreign, unfamiliar. It was the same streets he had walked 1,000 times before, but now everything looked different. Maybe it was because he was seeing it through a different lens, a world where Mia no longer belonged to him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him back to reality. For a brief second, his heart leapt. Maybe it was Mia. Maybe she had changed her mind. Maybe his chest deflated when he saw the name on the screen. Jason. He let the call ring a few times before sighing and picking up. Yeah? Where the hell are you? Jason's voice was laced with irritation. I called you like 5 times. You disappeared in the middle of a meeting. Daniel had completely forgotten about that. He closed his eyes, pressing his fingers to his temple. I had something to take care of. Jason scoffed. Something more important than the investors who just walked out because their CEO couldn't even bother to show up? Daniel didn't respond. He didn't have the energy to care. Jason sighed on the other end. Look, man, I don't know what's going on with you, but you need to pull it together. You've been off lately. First, you disappear early from work. Then you start zoning out every time someone talks to you. And now this? What's going on? Daniel leaned against a nearby lamppost, the cold metal grounding him for a second. He didn't want to talk about this. Not to Jason. Not to anyone. But the silence stretched too long, and Jason picked up on it. Wait, this isn't about Mia, is it? Daniel's grip on his phone tightened. Jason cursed under his breath. It is, isn't it? Jesus, Daniel. There was a beat of silence before he spoke again, this time slower. I told you this would happen. I told you one day she'd stop waiting. Daniel's teeth clenched. He didn't need to hear this right now. You always thought she'd be there, Jason continued, his tone somewhere between frustration and pity. You thought you had all the time in the world. But guess what? Time ran out. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, inhaling sharply. I know that. Do you? Jason asked, because you're acting like you can still fix this. Daniel's head snapped up. I can fix this. Jason let out a short, dry laugh. Daniel, she's not a business deal you can negotiate your way back into. You can't just decide you want her now and expect her to come running. Daniel's stomach twisted. Jason sighed. Look, I get it, man. I do. But if you really care about her, if you actually love her, then the best thing you can do is let her be happy. Daniel felt something sharp lodge itself in his throat. He hated that Jason was right, but he wasn't ready to give up. He hung up without another word, shoving his phone back into his pocket. His mind was at war with itself. One part of him knew he should walk away, that Mia deserved better than someone who only realised her worth when she was already gone. But the other part refused to accept that this was it. Mia had been everything he never let himself need. And now, when he finally saw it, she was slipping through his fingers like sand. And Daniel wasn't sure if he could live with that. The thought haunted him as he walked back to his car, his fingers tapping restlessly against his leg. He sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Jason's words echoed in his head. If you really love her, let her be happy. But what if he could make her happy? What if he just needed one more chance? As he sat there, staring at the empty street in front of him, an idea began to take shape in his mind. Maybe Mia thought she was done with him. But Daniel wasn't done with her. Not yet. Daniel's fingers drummed restlessly against the steering wheel, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. Every rational part of him told him to leave it alone, to let Mia go, to accept that he had lost her. But the problem was, Daniel had never been good at losing. He had spent his whole life winning. In business, in negotiations, in every aspect of his life, he had always been the one in control. He had been the one people chased, the one people waited for. And for years, Mia had been one of them. But now, she wasn't waiting anymore, and that realization burned. He ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling sharply. His mind replayed the moment she had looked him in the eye and told him he couldn't just show up now and expect things to be the same. The certainty in her voice, the way she didn't hesitate, that was what terrified him the most. She had always been soft with him, even when he didn't deserve it. She had always looked at him like he was someone worth waiting for. But tonight, for the first time, she had looked at him like he was just another man she used to know, and Daniel wasn't sure how to handle that. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, but this time he ignored it. He knew it was Jason, probably calling to remind him of what an idiot he was, but Daniel didn't need to hear it from someone else. He already knew. He had spent years rejecting Mia, pushing her aside like she was an option he could pick up whenever he felt like it. And now, when she was finally gone, he was scrambling to get her back. He wanted to tell himself it was just jealousy, that it was just his ego bruised from seeing her with someone else. But the truth ran deeper than that. Mia had been the only person who had ever truly seen him, and he had thrown that away. The thought made his grip tighten on the wheel. He didn't want to be this person, the man who only realised what he had when it was already too late. But what if it wasn't too late? What if there was still a chance? His mind raced through every possible way to fix this, to undo the damage he had caused. He couldn't just show up at her doorstep again. She had already made it clear she wasn't going to entertain his sudden change of heart. So if talking wasn't an option, he needed another approach, something that would make her listen. Then, like a switch flipping in his brain, an idea formed, one that was reckless, probably stupid, but the only thing that made sense. Mia had spent years waiting for him. She had spent years showing him she cared. Now, it was his turn to prove to her that he wasn't the same man she had walked away from. Without another thought, Daniel shifted his car into gear and pulled out onto the street. He knew exactly where he needed to go, and if Mia thought he was going to let her go without a fight, she was wrong. Mia sat curled up on her couch, a cup of tea resting on the coffee table in front of her. The glow of the streetlights filtered through her curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. She should have felt relief. She should have felt closure. Instead, she just felt tired. She had spent so long waiting for Daniel to care. And now that he suddenly did, it didn't feel like the victory she had once imagined. It felt exhausting, because she knew it wasn't about her. Daniel didn't want her because he loved her. He wanted her because he had lost control. And that was the difference between him and Lucas. Lucas had never made her wait. He had never played games or made her feel like she had to prove she was worth loving. From the moment they met, he had treated her like she mattered, and that was why she had chosen to move on. She sighed, rubbing her temples. She didn't want to think about Daniel anymore. She had already wasted too many years doing that. But as if the universe was determined to test her, her phone buzzed. Her heart clenched when she saw his name on the screen. She hesitated for a second before letting out a slow breath and declining the call. She had nothing left to say, but Daniel, as she would soon find out, wasn't done talking. Daniel stood outside the restaurant, his heart hammering against his ribs. The same restaurant where Mia had taken that picture with him, with the man who had done what Daniel never had. Lucas. He didn't know what he was doing here. He hadn't planned this far ahead. All he knew was that if he wanted Mia back, he needed to understand the man she had replaced him with. The doors swung open, and Daniel tensed as he spotted him. Lucas stepped out, his expression relaxed, his movements effortless. There was no arrogance in his demeanour, no need to prove himself. And that was what made Daniel hate him even more, because Lucas had won without even trying. Daniel took a step forward before he could stop himself. Lucas. The other man turned at the sound of his name, his brows lifting slightly in surprise. Daniel. He tilted his head. Didn't expect to see you here. Daniel forced a tight smile. I bet. Lucas studied him for a moment before slipping his hands into his pockets. Let me guess. You want to talk about Mia. Daniel clenched his jaw. He hated the way Lucas said her name, like he had every right to. Lucas sighed, shaking his head. Look, man, I'm not here to start something. But if you're here to try and change her mind, you're wasting your time. Daniel's eyes darkened. That's not your decision to make. Lucas let out a quiet laugh, but there was no amusement in it. You still don't get it, do you? He took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. Mia isn't something you win back. She's not a deal you can negotiate. She's a person who spent years loving someone who didn't love her back. Daniel's fist clenched. That's not true. Lucas held his gaze, unshaken. Then why did it take losing her for you to realize what you had? Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out, because there was no good answer. Lucas exhaled, glancing toward the street. I know you think you're fighting for her, but ask yourself this. Are you fighting for her? Or are you fighting for your own pride? Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had come here expecting a confrontation, expecting to prove something. But instead, he was standing in front of a man who had already beaten him, not with arrogance, not with anger, but with the one thing Daniel had never given Mia. Consistency. Lucas gave him one last look before turning to leave. If you really care about her, don't make this harder for her than it already is. Daniel watched as Lucas disappeared down the street, his mind a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't name. For the first time, doubt crept in. What if he was too late? What if Mia was never his to win back? And worst of all, what if Lucas was right? Daniel stood motionless outside the restaurant, his hands clenched at his sides. The conversation with Lucas played on repeat in his mind, each word digging deeper into the raw wound of his own making. He had come here expecting to prove something, expecting to challenge the man who had taken his place. Instead, he had walked away with a sinking realization. Lucas wasn't his enemy. Lucas wasn't the problem. He was. For the first time, Daniel had to face the harshest truth of all. He had lost Mia long before she ever walked away. He had lost her in every moment he had dismissed her, every time he had chosen distance over vulnerability, every time he had made her feel like she was reaching for something that would never be hers. And now, standing in the shadow of the life she had built without him, he had to ask himself, was he fighting for Mia, or was he fighting against the consequences of his own choices? The thought made his stomach twist. He could leave right now. He could admit defeat, drive away, and let Mia have the happiness she had finally found. That would be the right thing to do, wouldn't it? But the idea of walking away, of never seeing her again, of letting someone else be the one to make her smile, that thought shattered him. His chest ached as he glanced at his phone, staring at Mia's name on the screen. She hadn't called back. She hadn't texted. She had let him go as easily as he had once let her slip through his fingers. He wasn't used to being the one left behind. He wasn't used to being the one chasing. But more than anything, he wasn't used to losing something that actually mattered. Without thinking, he got back into his car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as he stared blankly at the road ahead. He didn't know where to go. He didn't know what to do. For the first time in his life, he had no plan, no strategy, no control. The only thing he knew was that he couldn't let it end like this. He needed to see Mia one last time. Mia sighed as she curled deeper into the corner of her couch, her laptop open on her lap, though she hadn't read a single word on the screen. The tea on the table had gone cold, untouched. Her phone sat beside it, Daniel's missed call still staring back at her. She had ignored it. She had wanted to answer, but she couldn't. Talking to Daniel again would only make things harder. It would make her question everything she had fought so hard to let go of. She had spent years waiting for him, hoping for him, only to be met with silence. Now, when she had finally found peace, when she had finally stopped waiting, now he wanted to talk. She shook her head, leaning back against the cushions. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that he got to walk away all those years without a second thought. And now he got to barge back in and make her feel like this again. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Her stomach clenched. She didn't need to check to know who it was. For a moment, she considered pretending she wasn't home. She could ignore him, just like she had ignored his call, just like she had told him earlier that there was nothing left to say. But something inside her told her that Daniel wasn't the type to leave that easily. Letting out a slow breath, she rose from the couch and made her way to the door, her fingers tightening around the handle before she finally pulled it open. There he was. Daniel stood in the hallway, his hair slightly disheveled, his shirt wrinkled from the rain earlier. He looked different, not in a way that was noticeable to anyone else, but to her. It was in his eyes. He looked lost. Mia swallowed, keeping her expression neutral. Daniel. His lips parted slightly as if he had rehearsed what he was going to say, but had forgotten the words the moment he saw her. He let out a slow breath. Can we talk? Mia hesitated. She shouldn't let him in. She shouldn't give him another chance to confuse her, to make her feel things she had spent so long trying to forget. But there was something about the way he was looking at her, something she had never seen before. She stepped aside. Daniel walked in, his movements slower than usual, almost uncertain. She closed the door behind him and turned, folding her arms across her chest as she leaned against the wall. Say whatever you came to say, Daniel. He looked around the apartment, taking in the space that was now entirely hers. He had been here before, but something felt different now. Maybe because the last time he had been here, she had still been his in a way. Now, she wasn't. He finally turned to face her, his hand slipping into his pockets as he exhaled. I know I don't deserve to be here. Mia blinked, caught off guard by his sudden honesty. Then, why are you here? Daniel's jaw tensed, and for a second, he almost looked nervous. Because I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted. Because I don't know how to just let you go. Mia's heart tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. That's not my problem, Daniel. He flinched slightly, but he didn't back down. I know I did this to myself. I know I had my chance and I threw it away. But Mia, He swallowed hard. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if I can fix this. But I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you. She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. You didn't mean to. But you did. Daniel looked down for a second, his shoulders tense. I know. The silence stretched between them, thick and unspoken. Mia wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he was here because he had truly changed, not just because he was afraid of losing her. But she had believed in him before. And where had that gotten her? She sighed, rubbing her forehead. Daniel, what do you want from me? He looked at her then, his eyes raw in a way she had never seen before. I just want to know if there's still a chance. Mia inhaled sharply. This was it. This was the moment she had once dreamed of. The moment he would finally realize what she had always been worth. But as she looked at him now, she realized something. She didn't need his validation anymore. She didn't need to hear him say he wanted her, because she already had something so much more important. She had herself. She took a deep breath, her voice steady. No, Daniel. His expression fell, but he didn't argue. He just stood there, the reality sinking in. Mia met his gaze, her heart calm for the first time in years. I spent so much time waiting for you to love me, but the truth is, I don't need you to anymore. The finality in her voice was undeniable. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time he looked truly defeated. He nodded once, swallowing hard before stepping toward the door. He hesitated, as if wanting to say something else, but instead he simply looked at her one last time. Goodbye, Mia. And then, just like she had once waited for him, he waited, just for a second, just in case she might change her mind. But she didn't. And this time, it was him who walked away. The door clicked shut behind Daniel, and for the first time in years, Mia felt something she never thought she would. Relief. She stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. She had imagined this moment so many times before, but it had never played out like this. In her mind, if Daniel ever came back, it would be a grand gesture, an apology that made everything worth it, a confession that would finally fill the void he had left in her heart. But now, standing alone in the quiet of her apartment, she realized that void wasn't there anymore. She had already filled it herself. She walked slowly to the couch, sinking into the cushions as she let out a deep breath. It was over, really over, and not because Daniel had walked away, but because she had let him. Because for once, she had put herself first. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen. Lucas. A small smile tugged at her lips as she reached for it, but she hesitated before answering. Not because she didn't want to talk to him. She did, but because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't reaching for someone to save her. She was saving herself. Mia exhaled softly before pressing the answer button. Hey, she said, her voice steady. Lucas's voice came through the speaker, warm and familiar. Hey, how are you? She thought about it for a second. About the years she had spent chasing after love, about the heartbreak she'd carried for too long, about the fear she had once had of never being enough. And then she smiled. I'm good, she said. and for the first time in a long time, she meant it. Daniel drove aimlessly through the city, his hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him together. The streets blurred past him, neon signs flashing through the windshield, but he barely saw any of it. Mia's voice echoed in his head, over and over again. "I don't need you to anymore." The words had cut deeper than he expected. He had spent so long believing that if he ever wanted her back, he could have her, that she was waiting for him, that she always would be, but she wasn't waiting anymore. She had moved on, she had healed, and now she was happy without him. A sharp pain twisted in his chest. He had thought the worst thing in the world was losing her. But he had been wrong. The worst thing in the world was realizing he had never truly had her to begin with. Because love wasn't something you ignored until it was convenient. It wasn't something you neglected and expected to still be there when you finally decided you wanted it. Love was something you chose, every day. And Daniel had never chosen her. Not when it mattered. Now, someone else had. The thought made his stomach turn. Lucas. He hated him, not because of who he was, but because he had done something Daniel never had. He had seen Mia. He had loved her the way she deserved to be loved. Daniel wanted to hate him for that, but he couldn't, because Lucas had won fair and square. He let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the wheel as he finally pulled into his driveway. His house had never felt lonelier than it did at that moment. He killed the engine and sat there in the silence, staring at the empty space beside him where Mia used to sit. He thought about calling her, thought about texting, thought about saying one last thing that might change her mind. But he already knew the truth. There were no more words, no more second chances. Mia had finally walked away, and this time she wasn't looking back. Mia stood on the balcony of her apartment later that night, the city lights twinkling around her, a cool breeze brushing against her skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, not out of sadness, but out of something different, something peaceful. She wasn't heartbroken, she wasn't devastated, she wasn't even angry, she was just free. For years, she had thought Daniel was her story, that he was the one she was meant to end up with, that all the waiting, all the heartbreak would somehow be worth it. But now she knew the truth. Daniel had just been a chapter, a long, painful, necessary chapter that had led her to where she was now. And where she was now, she liked it. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Lucas. He had checked in twice since their call, making sure she was okay. And the difference between him and Daniel was clear in that single action. Lucas didn't make her wait. He had always been there, always steady, always present. He had never made her feel like she had to chase after him or prove her worth. He had simply seen her. And now, for the first time, she saw herself too. She glanced at the message. Lucas. Dinner tomorrow? No pressure. Just thought it might be nice. Mia smiled, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She could have waited. She could have played it safe, taken more time. But for what? She didn't need to wait anymore. She didn't need permission to be happy. Mia, I'd love that. She sent the message and set her phone down, leaning against the railing as she looked out over the city. For years, she had waited for Daniel to choose her. But now, she was choosing herself. And that was the best love story of all. The next morning, Daniel woke up to the harsh morning light seeping through the blinds. His head ached, but not from alcohol, not from anything physical. It was the weight in his chest, the emptiness that followed him even after sleep, the realization that nothing had changed overnight. Mia was still gone. He sat up, running a hand through his hair as he exhaled. His bed felt too big, his house too quiet. It had always been this way, But before, he had never noticed. Before, he had filled his time with work, distractions, meaningless company that had never truly mattered. Now, all of it felt hollow. His phone buzzed beside him, and for a second, hope flickered through him. But when he glanced at the screen, his stomach twisted. Not Mia. It was an automated message from his assistant, reminding him of his schedule for the day. Meetings, presentations, the same routine that had once been his entire world. The same routine that had, in part, cost him the one thing he now realized he couldn't replace. He let out a slow breath and tossed the phone onto the nightstand. It wasn't that he had expected Mia to call. He wasn't that delusional. But part of him had still hoped. He pulled himself out of bed, forcing himself to go through the motions of his usual morning routine. Shower, coffee, news playing in the background. But everything felt off. Even the coffee tasted bitter, though he had made it the exact same way he always had. Or maybe it had always been bitter, and he had just never noticed. By the time he got to the office, he was on autopilot. He sat through meetings, nodded at the right times, said what people expected him to say. But the entire time, his mind was somewhere else. It was with her. It was with the way she had looked at him last night. Not with anger, not with longing, but with indifference. That had been the hardest part. Because if she had been angry, it would have meant she still cared. If she had cried, it would have meant there was still something left to salvage. But she had just let him go, like he was nothing more than a person she had once known. Daniel! He blinked, realizing someone was saying his name. Jason stood across from him, arms crossed, watching him with something between concern and irritation. "You've been zoning out all morning," Jason said. "You want to tell me what's going on? Or should I just assume you finally lost your mind?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. "It's nothing," Jason scoffed. "Right, because you always look like you got hit by a truck for nothing." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You went to see her, didn't you?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. Jason sighed. "And?" Daniel clenched his jaw. "She's done with me." Jason stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "You really thought you could just show up and say a few words, and she'd come running back, didn't you?" Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "I don't know what I thought." Jason leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms. "So, what now?" Daniel hesitated. He had spent the last 24 hours convinced he had to do something, that there was still a way to fix it, still a way to get her back. But now? Now, he wasn't so sure. Because for the first time, he wasn't just thinking about what he wanted, he was thinking about her. He thought about the way she had looked at him, the peace in her eyes, the way she had smiled, not for him, but for herself. Mia didn't need him anymore, and if he truly cared about her, he had to accept that. "I let her go," Daniel finally said, the words foreign on his tongue. Jason raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Just like that?" Daniel let out a slow breath. "Number, not just like that. It took me way too long to get here." He looked down at his hands, flexing them slightly, as if trying to shake off the weight that had settled there. "But, yeah, I let her go." Jason studied him for a second before nodding. "Good." Daniel glanced up, arching a brow. "Good?" Jason shrugged. "Yeah, because, for once, you're doing the right thing." Daniel exhaled, leaning back in his chair. The conversation should have made him feel worse, but instead there was a strange sense of calm settling over him. It didn't erase the regret. It didn't make up for everything he had done wrong. But it was something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing something he had already lost. He was learning to live with it. That night, Mia sat on the rooftop of her apartment building, a cup of tea in her hands. The city stretched out before her, endless and bright. But she wasn't thinking about the lights. She was thinking about how much had changed in just a few days. She had spent so long believing that her happiness depended on Daniel, that she would never be able to fully move on, that there would always be a part of her waiting for him to wake up. But she wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't afraid of being alone. And maybe, for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next either. Her phone buzzed beside her, and when she saw Lucas's name, she didn't hesitate. She picked up, smiling slightly as she answered. "Hey," he said, his voice warm, familiar. "How was your day?" Mia looked out at the skyline, the air cool against her skin, her heart light. "It was good," she said, her smile growing. "Really good." And for the first time in her life, she wasn't lying. Days passed, then a week, then 2. The world didn't stop for heartbreak. The sun still rose every morning, the streets still filled with life, and time kept moving forward, whether Daniel was ready for it or not. He buried himself in work. Meetings, deals, late nights at the office. He threw himself into the one thing he still had control over. But no matter how many hours he spent drowning himself in distractions, nothing changed the truth. Mia was gone. She had moved on, and for the first time in his life, Daniel had to do the same. It wasn't easy. Some mornings, he woke up expecting to see a message from her, an old habit resurfacing in his mind. Some nights, he drove past familiar places. The cafe she loved, the bookstore where she used to drag him inside, excitedly showing him a new find, only to remind himself that those moments belonged to a past he could never get back. But something strange happened as time passed. The pain didn't go away overnight, but it changed. It became quieter, less suffocating. It no longer controlled his every thought, no longer made him feel like he was unraveling. He learned to live with it, and in a way, that was its own kind of healing. One evening, after another long day at work, Daniel found himself sitting on the balcony of his apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The city stretched out before him, glowing in the distance, endless and full of possibilities. For so long, he had believed Mia was his only chance at happiness. That without her, he was lost. But now, as he sat there, alone but not broken, he realized something. Mia had found happiness without him, and maybe, just maybe, he could do the same. He wasn't there yet, but for the first time he wanted to try. Mia, meanwhile, was in a place she never thought she'd be, fully at peace. She had spent years waiting for Daniel, convincing herself that love was something that had to be earned, something that had to be chased. But love wasn't supposed to be painful. It wasn't supposed to make her feel like she was not enough. With Lucas, things were different. There was no guessing, no waiting, no hoping for something that might never come. There was just being seen, being valued, being loved in a way that didn't feel like a battle she had to fight. It wasn't perfect. No love ever was. But it was real. It was steady. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't scared of it. She had dinner with Lucas that evening, laughing over something silly, feeling lighter than she had in years. And for the first time, when she thought of Daniel, she didn't feel pain. She didn't feel longing. She just felt gratitude, because if he had never broken her heart, she might have never learned to love herself the way she deserved. As she walked home that night, the city warm around her, she realized something. She wasn't the woman who had once stood in front of Daniel, hoping he would see her. She wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. And maybe that was the greatest love story of all. Daniel never reached out again. He thought about it once or twice, but in the end, he knew better. Mia had made her choice, and this time it was his turn to let go. One evening, he passed by a flower shop, the same one he had once walked by 1,000 times without a second glance. But this time, he stopped. There, in the display window, was a bouquet of white lilies, the kind Mia had once mentioned loving in a conversation he had barely paid attention to. He stared at them for a long moment before walking inside. The florist greeted him with a smile. "Looking for something special?" Daniel hesitated. Then, for reasons he didn't quite understand, he nodded. "Yes," he said simply. "Something for a fresh start." And as he walked out of the shop, a bouquet of white lilies in hand, he didn't know where life would take him next, but for the first time, he was ready to find out. And that was enough. Thank you all for listening to this story with our channel. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe to motivate us to bring more interesting stories. Much love to all of you.